She screamed like she'd been electrocuted, and in a way, she had. Karen Blackstone, president of the HOA, queen of clipped hedges and unsolicited opinions, had just learned a valuable lesson about trespassing the hard way. Her sandals went flying as she toppled backward into a lawn chair, flailing dramatically in front of her horrified book club. One of her little yapping dogs yelped. Her husband spilled a plate of deviled eggs, and me? I just sipped my lemonade from the porch and waved. "Private property, Karen," I called. "You might want to read the signs next time." That's the day the war began. And no, I didn't start it, but I finished it with 600 volts, 2 very loyal dogs, and a whole lot of patience. My name's Tom. I'm a 59-year-old Vietnam vet, retired engineer, and about as easygoing as a man can be, until someone tries to take what's his. I bought my 12-acre property 15 years ago, long before the subdivision even existed. Back then, this land was nothing but overgrown scrub and a half-burned barn. Took me 3 years to clear it, rebuild the barn, and put in a fence strong enough to keep coyotes out and the occasional wild teenager in. I grow a little produce, raise chickens, and keep to myself. Quiet life. Peaceful. That is, until the HOA moved in next door. At first, it was nothing but a few rows of cookie-cutter houses and fancy mailboxes. Then came the laminated rules, the trash can fines, the lawn color regulations, and, of course, the lady herself, Karen Blackstone. She rolled in with a minivan full of superiority and a clipboard that never left her side. I kept my distance. I wasn't part of the HOA, my land didn't touch their official zone, and I figured if I ignored them, they'd ignore me. I figured wrong. It started small. A couple walking their golden doodle wandered past my broken gate one morning and gave me a cheery, "Hope you don't mind," as their dog peed on my fence post. Then a teenager cut through my back field on his way to school, stomping right through a patch of baby lettuce. When I confronted him, he said, "I thought this was like community land or something." That's when I knew something wasn't right. A week later, a flyer showed up in my mailbox. Quarterly HOA updates, expanded access to recreational green space. Below it, a crudely drawn map outlined a section of my back pasture in yellow highlighter, with communal use zone scribbled over it. I stared at it for a long time, then walked outside and looked at the land in question. It was mine. Every inch of it. Bought and paid for. Deeded and documented. I figured it was a mistake. Maybe a printer glitch or a neighbor with too much wine and too little sense. But just to be safe, I drove down to the HOA clubhouse and asked to speak with someone. That's when I met her. Karen Blackstone stood behind the front desk like she was guarding Fort Knox. She wore pearls, lipstick so red it could stop traffic, and a beige pantsuit that probably had its own HOA rulebook. She looked me up and down like I was a stray she didn't want to feed. "Can I help you?" she said, clearly hoping I'd say no. I held up the flyer. "Yeah, you can tell me why this says part of my land is now shared." She gave a smile so tight it could cut glass. "Oh, that? It's just a minor rezoning. The board agreed your back lot is underutilized and would better serve the community as a shared recreation space. You weren't using it, after all." "I grow vegetables there," I said. "Oh, organic?" she asked, clearly not listening. "That's lovely. Maybe you can host a farmer's market." It took everything in me not to laugh. Or yell. Or both. I handed her a copy of my deed the next day. She smiled, thanked me, and sent another flyer out the following week. This time with a schedule for weekly community yoga at the far meadow. That was when I realized I wasn't dealing with confusion or error. I was dealing with entitlement in high heels. Within days, my pasture became a parade ground. Kids on scooters. Parents with folding chairs. A group of retirees doing what looked like synchronized Tai Chi between my tomato rows. One guy even brought a drone and hovered it over my chicken coop, laughing while the hens squawked and scattered. When I told him to cut it out, he said, "Relax, man, it's public access. Talk to the HOA." So I did. I went back to Karen, this time with a folder full of legal documents and my lawyer on speakerphone. She didn't flinch. Just sipped her lemon water and told me I could take it up with the board. That's when she dropped the real bomb. "We've hired a surveyor," she said, like it was the final word. "If they find the community has historical access to your land, we may file for easement rights." I stared at her, stunned. Historical access? Karen, this isn't the Oregon Trail. You people have been here for 2 years. She smiled. Yes, but the community thrives on shared space. You wouldn't want to be the reason we lose our unity, would you? I walked out without saying a word. Just nodded to myself and made a plan. Because here's the thing about war. Whether you're overseas or in your own backyard, once someone crosses the line, you don't let them do it twice. So I bought new fencing. Not the flimsy kind either. Steel posts. Reinforced wire. And in the center, a brand new electric system, legal and up to code, with warning signs in 4 languages and motion-activated cameras for good measure. I called up my nephew, a tech-savvy ranch hand with a mean streak and a knack for automation. We spent 3 days wiring the perimeter and training the system. Then I let the dogs out. Not just any dogs. 2 retired K9s from my buddy's security company. Sweet as pie until you cross a line. And boy did they love lines. The first time Karen got zapped, it wasn't even my fault. The warning signs were everywhere. But she didn't read signs, she gave orders. She marched onto my land, lecturing some poor yoga lady about poses, when her foot tapped the wrong wire. She shrieked so loud birds flew out of trees. And me? I leaned on the porch post and took a long, slow sip of lemonade. That was day 1. By day 7, the war was official, and I had just begun to dig in. They started showing up like mosquitoes at sunset, slow at first, then in swarms. Cars parked along my dirt access road, tailgates dropping open, coolers dragged across my grass without a second thought. Some folks even brought little collapsible tables like they were settling in for a picnic at the city park. The worst part? They waved at me like I was some kind of friendly park ranger, just thrilled to host their suburban invasion. One woman asked if I had a porta-potty they could use. Another brought her 3 kids and a Bluetooth speaker blasting beach tunes. It would have been funny if it weren't my land. I tried talking to a few of them, calmly at first. I pointed out the clearly posted, private property, signs and explained this wasn't public land, no matter what the HOA had told them. Some apologized and left. Most didn't. One guy actually laughed and said, "Well, if it's such a problem, take it up with Karen." That became the refrain. Everything was, "Karen said it's fine," or "Karen told us it was allowed," like she was the mayor of some invisible city-state where my rights didn't apply. It wasn't long before I noticed the real damage. My backfield, where I'd planted new squash and cucumbers, had become a makeshift soccer field for some neighborhood kid. The young ones didn't mean harm, I get that, but they'd trampled entire rows flat chasing a foam ball while their parents chatted and sipped kombucha. A teen on a dirt bike even used the small slope behind my shed as a ramp and tore deep ruts into the ground. When I confronted him, he said, "It's community space. HOA rules say we're allowed." My mom talked to Karen. I didn't blame the kids. I blamed the ringleader, Karen. When I showed up at the next HOA meeting, the entire room went silent like I'd wandered into a church service with muddy boot. Karen stood at the front of the clubhouse like a smug little monarch, her clipboard perched on the podium. The room was full of homeowners sipping wine out of plastic cups and nodding along to her every word. I asked for the floor. She said I had 3 minutes. I began with facts. My land purchase date. The property lines clearly outlined on my deed. The GPS coordinate. Tax records. All proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the so-called shared green space was, in fact, my private farmland. Karen blinked slowly through all of it, like a cat watching a laser pointer. When I finished, she cleared her throat and said, "While we appreciate your perspective, The HOA has reviewed historical access patterns to that portion of land and determined that it's now considered common recreational space under our revised bylaw 431. I stared at her. You're revising HOA bylaws to apply to land the HOA doesn't own? She smiled like she'd won something. The community's needs come first. Your backlit was previously unutilized, so we have full justification. I could practically hear my blood boiling in my ears. So if my neighbor's house looks empty, you gonna let people host potlucks in their living room? Karen laughed lightly. Let's not be dramatic, Mr. Jacobs. I walked out before I said something I'd regret. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next morning, I noticed a white SUV parked near the tree line behind my barn. A man in a neon vest and khakis walked around with a measuring tape, jotting things on a clipboard. I walked out and asked who he was. He said he was conducting a land survey for the HOA. When I asked for credentials, he handed me a business card that looked like it had been printed from a home computer. His name was Barry. He admitted, after some poking, that he was Karen's cousin. I told Barry he had exactly 30 seconds to leave my property before I called the sheriff. He left, but not before making a dramatic show of photographing my field and muttering about civil claims. That same week, a notice showed up on my gate from the county office, something about an HOA claim to establish a recreational easement. The document looked official but vague, full of soft legal language like potential rights to reasonable access and temporary use considerations. It was clear Karen was playing dirty. I went straight to my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda who had dealt with land disputes, mineral rights, and one extremely entertaining case involving a rooster with an anger problem. She read the notice and rolled her eyes. "This isn't a valid claim," she said. "But they're trying to bury you in process. It's a game of attrition. They file junk paperwork hoping you'll get tired, sell out, or give in. Not happening." Linda filed a cease and desist order, and we submitted updated boundary verification to the county. In response, Karen and her board filed an intent to establish a community green zone, citing a reinterpreted zoning clause buried in some dusty county ordinance from the 1980s. It was nonsense, but it was strategic nonsense. Karen wasn't trying to win a legal battle. She was trying to exhaust me. Legally, emotionally, and financially. Then came the letters. HOA members started taping polite but passive-aggressive notes to my gate. One read, "As a neighbor, I ask you to consider the children. Open land is rare, and we cherish our weekend playtime." Another simply said, "Don't be that guy." Someone even left a basket of muffins with a note that said, "Maybe we can work something out if you stop being so uptight." They didn't realize they weren't pushing around some meek retiree. I had seen worse than this in the military, in corporate engineering meetings, and in family court. If Karen wanted to drag this out, I was prepared to go the distance. But the final straw came when I caught 2 HOA members in my barn. They said they were just exploring. One was holding a camera. The other had his hands in his pockets, trying to act casual next to my lawnmower and toolbox. I walked in, stood silently, and pointed toward the door. They left, mumbling apologies, but I knew what they were doing. Gathering evidence. Looking for any crack they could exploit. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on my porch with my 2 dogs at my feet, watching the moon rise over what was supposed to be my peaceful land. And that's when I made the decision. No more talking. No more meetings. No more flyers or muffins or polite notes taped to fences. It was time to draw a line. Not just a metaphorical one, but a real, physical, unmistakable line. The kind you can't cross without feeling it. The kind that comes with warnings. The kind that bites. They wanted access? Let's see how they handled consequences. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I already had a list. A real, honest-to-God list, written in pen on a yellow legal pad. At the top it said solutions, but what it really meant was payback. Not revenge, exactly, Just a logical, undeniable pushback against people who'd mistaken my patience for surrender. They'd stepped on my land, ignored my warnings, lied to the county, and tried to manipulate the law. Fine. If they wanted a line, I'd give them one. A glowing, humming, bite if you cross it kind of line. And just for good measure, I'd put teeth on the other side. I started with the fencing. Not that cheap, thin stuff from the local hardware store, but serious, farm-grade electric fencing built to handle anything from cattle to mountain lions. I ordered it from a supplier upstate and told them exactly what I needed. Steel posts, 12-gauge wire, insulators, grounding rods, and a solar-powered energizer unit strong enough to snap a grown man's wristwatch clean off. The guy on the phone chuckled and asked, "Coyotes or people?" I told him, little of both. He overnighted the order for free. Next came the warning signs. Big ones. Fluorescent yellow with bold red lettering that said things like private property, electric fence, do not touch, and no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted. I even found a company online that printed custom ones. One of them read, "If you're reading this, you're already on camera." Another one simply said, "Hope Karen told you about the voltage." But I didn't stop at just fencing. I needed something more, something alive, something that would deter the brave or the stupid or both. That's when I made a call to my old Army buddy Mitch, who ran a private security business just outside of town. Mitch was one of those guys who always had a solution for everything, usually with a grin and a cooler full of cold beer. I asked him if he still had those retired K9 units he'd mentioned once. He laughed like he'd been waiting for the call. 2 days later, he rolled up in a black pickup truck with 2 German shepherds in the back, Duke and Major. Both were lean, muscled, and alert, their eyes tracking every movement like they were reading intentions. Mitch assured me they were trained for perimeter control, silent pursuit, and response on command. But the best part? They weren't aggressive unless someone crossed a line. Literally. They respect the fence, he said. But they don't like it when people don't. I built a shaded kennel near the barn, installed an autofeeder, and made sure they had everything they needed. Within a day, they knew every inch of my property. By day 2, they could smell a trespasser before the fence started clicking. Once everything was installed, I tested it myself. Glove on, voltage meter in hand, walking the length of the fence in the early morning mist. The hum was steady. The charge was real. And the sense of finality was beautiful. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a boundary with consequences. The first incident came 2 days later. Karen's husband, a doughy man named Craig who always wore socks with sandals and carried a clipboard like it granted him authority, tried to cut through my field on his morning walk. I saw him from the kitchen window, holding his phone up like he was documenting something. He didn't see the new fence until it was too late. His foot hit the bottom wire, and with a loud pop, he flinched so hard he dropped his phone into a mud puddle. Duke barked once from the tree line, a deep warning sound, and Craig did a sort of panicked hop-skip back the way he came, limping and cursing. About 20 minutes later, I got a knock at my gate. Karen stood there, fuming in a windbreaker and oversized sunglasses. "You assaulted my husband with your illegal fence," she snapped. "It's posted. It's legal. It's electrified and grounded to code," I said, holding up the laminated printout of county fencing laws. She threw her hands in the air. "He could have been killed," I smirked. "Only if he licked it." She stormed off, but I wasn't done. I took the video footage from my motion-triggered cameras, high-resolution clips showing Craig stepping over the posted signs, ignoring the boundaries, and getting what he deserved, and I emailed it to the local sheriff's department. Just in case. A few nights later, I got my first taste of real retaliation. Someone snuck in and tried to cut a section of my fence. They brought bolt cutters, judging by the clean edge, and were smart enough to shut off the breaker on the Energizer box. What they didn't count on was the backup power and the secondary perimeter sensor I'd set up. The moment the voltage dropped, a silent alarm pinged my phone, and within 30 seconds, both dogs were on the move. I stayed on the porch and watched the thermal camera feed as two blurry figures sprinted across my lower field, chased by a pair of fast-moving shadows with teeth. The intruders got away, barely, but one of them left behind a shoe, a phone case, and the unmistakable sound of someone yelling, "I thought you said it was turned off." The next morning, I posted a still image on my fence. Just a blurry frame of the two trespassers mid-sprint, with the words, "We're always watching. Dogs run faster than you." Karen didn't say much for a few days. But I knew she was scheming. That woman could weaponize silence better than most people could weaponize a lawsuit. Sure enough, by the end of the week, I got a visit from Animal Control. They said they received a report about aggressive dogs, unregistered and unlicensed, potentially dangerous to children. The officer was polite but skeptical. He asked to see the dogs, so I walked him over to the kennel. Duke and Major sat obediently behind the gate, tails thumping, ears alert but relaxed. The officer nodded, checked their tags and paperwork, and left with a shrug. Before he got into his truck, he muttered, "Between you and me, they're probably the best-behaved animals I've seen all month." An hour later, I checked my camera footage again. There she was, Karen, caught on tape earlier that morning, standing at my fence line, tossing strips of lunch meat over the wire and calling the dogs by name, baiting them, trying to provoke a reaction she could film. That's when I realized this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about control, about pride, about some power-hungry woman who couldn't stand that the one man on the edge of her kingdom wouldn't kneel. And me? I'd been pushed too far to care about playing nice. So I sent the footage to my lawyer, copied it to a hard drive, and dropped off a copy with the sheriff's office. Then I poured myself a whiskey, sat on the porch with my dogs at my feet, and watched the sun set behind my new fence. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Ready. It started just after midnight with a flicker on my motion sensor grid. The alert buzzed softly on my phone, and I sat up in bed before my feet even hit the floor. I already knew what it was. That strange sixth sense that develops when people have been testing your limits for too long. I pulled up the feed from the thermal camera mounted near the back fence, and there they were, 3 heat signatures crouching low, inching along the tree line. One of them held what looked like bolt cutters, and another was carrying a flashlight wrapped in red cloth to dull the beam. Amateurs. But determined ones. I didn't move. I didn't have to. Duke and Major had already noticed. They were out of the kennel by the time the second sensor pinged. I watched the screen in silence as the dogs circled wide and flanked the intruders like they'd rehearsed it. No barking. No warning. Just low, fast movement through the tall grass, eyes gleaming and bodies tense. It took less than 30 seconds for the first shout to break the stillness. Then chaos erupted. The flashlight hit the ground first, its red beam spinning wildly like a siren in a storm. One of the trespassers screamed, "Hi!" panicked, and started running back toward the HOA property line. Another fell flat, trying to scramble through a patch of uneven soil near the creek bed. Major stood over him, teeth bared but still restrained, waiting for my whistle. The third one made it halfway up the hill before Duke cut him off, growling low and pacing in tight circles to herd him back down. I stepped out onto the porch in nothing but pajama pants and a hoodie, shotgun cradled but not cocked. I didn't need to fire. I just needed to be seen. The porch light came on, flooding the yard in yellow. The dogs froze, looking back at me for instruction. I gave a short, sharp whistle. They backed off in perfect unison and trotted back to their posts. The intruders scattered, wheezing and stumbling, each one shouting about lawsuits and calling the cops. So I beat them to it. The sheriff and 2 deputies arrived 20 minutes later, all of them already familiar with the back and forth between me and the HOA. One of them was even the same officer who'd complimented my dogs just days earlier. I showed them the footage, offered coffee, and pointed out where the trespassers had dropped their tools. They found a discarded glove, the remains of a rope ladder, and a half-eaten protein bar near the creek. Amateur hour. The officers didn't say it out loud, but their smirks told me everything I needed to know. They left to follow up on a hunch, and within an hour they confirmed it. 2 of the trespassers were confirmed HOA members. The third was, no surprise, Karen's grown son who had just come home from college and apparently decided to lead a stealth mission on my farm like it was some kind of suburban Navy SEAL training exercise. When they brought him in for questioning, he claimed they were investigating unsafe fencing conditions. One of the officers later told me he almost laughed out loud at that one. The next morning, Karen tried to hold a press conference in her driveway. I'm not kidding. She actually stood in front of her garage, wearing a cardigan and holding a binder, giving some kind of neighborhood statement to a local news van that had picked up the story after the sheriff's report got posted online. She said words like toxic property owner, threat to the community, and unprovoked attack. The news clip went viral before noon, but not in the way she hoped. Turns out, people love watching bullies get humbled. Once the footage of her son caught on camera trespassing, running from 2 well-trained dogs, and tripping into a mud pit got out, it was over. Someone even added circus music and uploaded it to a meme channel. I got more views in a day than Karen got sympathy in a month. The internet decided pretty quickly whose side it was on. But Karen wasn't done. No, she went lower. She filed an official complaint claiming I had used the dogs as weapons. She even managed to twist it into a story about how my dogs lunged at a child during a neighborhood gathering, completely fabricated, of course. She tried to drag animal control back out, filed a harassment claim with the HOA board, and even called a local talk radio station to rant about how dangerous libertarian farmers are poisoning our community cohesion. This time, it backfired spectacularly. One of the new HOA board members, someone who'd been staying pretty quiet until now, stood up at the next meeting and read a full transcript of Karen's county complaint alongside footage proving it was all a lie. He asked how much of their HOA dues had gone toward fake surveyors, junk lawsuits, and legal fees defending personal vendettas. That meeting ended with raised voices, a vote, and a stunned silence that followed the phrase, "You're hereby removed as HOA president." Karen didn't scream or cry. She just blinked slowly, folded her notes, and walked out like nothing had happened. But something had. The air in the neighborhood shifted. Her grip was gone. She no longer controlled the story, the narrative, or the people who once nodded along with her every word. And without her spotlight, she shrank faster than a slug under salt. The new HOA president, a practical guy named Mark who wore jeans and actually said, "Howdy," unironically, stopped by my place 2 days later with a homemade pecan pie and a smile. He apologized on behalf of the board, said they were reviewing every policy Karen had creatively interpreted, and swore they'd stay in their lane going forward. He even offered to help pay for any fence repairs out of the HOA's discretionary fund. I told him not to worry about it. The fence was holding up just fine. And so were the dogs. For the first time in months, the land was quiet again. No uninvited book clubs. No rogue soccer games. No homemade yoga mats in the middle of my cucumbers. Just open sky, healthy crops, and the sound of Duke's paws trotting along the fence line like a sentry at ease. That night, as the last orange sliver of sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch and watched the dogs settle in by the barn. My phone buzzed. Another alert from the security system, but this one was routine, probably just a rabbit hopping too close to the wire. I silenced it and took a long sip of coffee. The war was over. The fence had held. The dogs had done their job. And as for Karen? Well, I figured she was somewhere inside her beige 2-story home, muttering about fairness, nursing a bruised ego, and Googling states that didn't have electric fences or stubborn farmers with cameras. Maybe she'd even learned something. Probably not. But I had. I learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict. Sometimes, peace is the quiet hum of a well-grounded fence and the soft click of claws pacing the border. And sometimes peace comes with teeth. It didn't take long for word to spread. By the end of the week, my story had been picked up by 3 local papers, 2 radio shows, and a podcast that usually covered true crime but made an exception just to talk about the chaos that unfolded in our quiet little HOA suburb. They titled it The Fence War, and they weren't far off. One headline read, "Local Farmer Electrifies Fence, Electrifies Internet." Another one called me the Dogfather. I didn't know whether to laugh or start charging appearance fees. All I knew was that people finally saw the truth. Not just about Karen, but about the absurdity of what she tried to pull off. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was yelling into a void. One video in particular hit a nerve with people. It was a short clip I'd pulled from my security footage. Karen's son running from Duke and falling face-first into a mud pit while Major stood by like a furry referee. Someone on the internet added dramatic music, slow motion, and a caption that read, "When your mom says it's community property but the dog says otherwise." It went viral in 2 days. By day 3, I had people emailing me from out of state asking if they could buy shirts with "Private property means private" printed over a silhouette of Duke and Major. A guy from Montana offered to send me a free pair of custom boots just for standing my ground. I thanked him and told him I wore size 12. What surprised me most wasn't the attention, it was the reaction from my own neighbors. People I barely knew began waving as they drove by. One woman who used to glare at me like I was polluting her HOA-approved air dropped off a basket of muffins and said, without irony, "You're the only sane one around here." Even the teenagers who used to cut through my land started detouring around the fence, probably afraid they'd end up in the next viral video. The balance had shifted. Not because I yelled the loudest, but because I was willing to do the one thing no one else had: stand firm and not blink. Karen, on the other hand, became a ghost. After she was removed as HOA president, she vanished from public view almost entirely. The only time I saw her again was 2 weeks later, loading boxes into the back of a U-Haul while her husband stood on the curb smoking a cigarette and staring off like he was trying to forget the last 6 months ever happened. They moved out quietly, no goodbye party, no final speech. Just a hollow echo where once there was constant noise. Her house went up for sale that same week. The new listing didn't mention anything about community land access or friendly HOA involvement. Imagine that. Mark, the new HOA president, kept his word. He came by every now and then, not to snoop or critique, but to check in like an actual neighbor. Once he brought his teenage son, a lanky kid named Tyler who loved dogs and ended up helping me clean out the barn. He asked about Duke and Major, wanted to know how they were trained, if he could ever learn. I said sure. I didn't have kids of my own, but maybe teaching someone like Tyler how to handle responsibility and respect boundaries was a good way to spend the quieter days. I made a few changes around the property, not because I had to, but because it felt right. I installed stronger lighting along the eastern fence line, added another camera or 2, and built a proper covered post at the entrance to hold deliveries and notices so people didn't have to leave things hanging from the gate. I even added a new sign that said, "No trespassing." Yes, it's still private. Ask Karen. Beneath that, I bolted a small plaque with a QR code linking to the news story about the fence war. Petty? Maybe. But it got a lot of laughs from the UPS guy and the occasional curious tourist driving by. My days went back to normal, more or less. Early mornings feeding the chickens, checking the irrigation lines, brushing down Duke and Major after their patrol lap. I started a small produce stand at the edge of the road. Nothing big, just fresh eggs, squash, and some homemade pickles in mason jars. People came by, paid in cash or dropped a few bills into the honesty box, and went on their way. It felt old-fashioned. It felt real. Like the land was finally mine again, not just on paper, but in spirit. There was one moment, maybe a month after everything had settled, when I caught myself standing by the barn at sunset, just watching the dogs stretch and shake the sleep from their coat. The light filtered through the trees in that soft gold you only get for about 10 minutes a day, and everything was quiet, peaceful. No shouting, no drones, no trespassers, just the hum of crickets and the smell of earth and grass. It hit me then, how close I'd come to losing all this. Not in a dramatic way, not with bulldozers or lawsuits, but slowly, sneakily, through 1,000 tiny encroachments. That's the danger no one talks about. People don't always take what's yours by force. Sometimes they smile while they do it. They hold meetings and send flyers and call it community enrichment. They use words like shared, collective, cooperative, until your name's been erased from the thing you built with your own hands. But fences don't lie. Dogs don't lie. And footage doesn't lie. That's why I kept all of it. Not because I wanted to relive it, but because I wanted to remember. That line out there isn't just a border. It's a promise. A few weeks later, the local paper reached out and asked if they could do a follow-up story. I agreed, as long as they didn't try to spin it into something it wasn't. The reporter came out with a camera crew, asked me to stand in front of the fence with Duke and Major beside me. He asked what advice I'd give to others in similar situations. I told him, build the fence before they get comfortable. Set the boundary loud and clear. And if they ignore it, make sure you've got good dogs, good cameras, and better resolve. That clip aired on the evening news, and the comments section filled up with applause, thumbs up, and about a dozen requests to buy my dogs. I didn't sell, of course. Duke and Major weren't for sale. They were family. Just like the land was mine. Not because I owned it on a deed, but because I fought for it, defended it, earned it every day. As summer rolled in, I noticed something funny. People started copying me. Not the electric fence, necessarily, but the attitude. A few other rural landowners in neighboring counties started putting up cameras, reinforcing their boundaries, standing up at their HOA meetings. One of them emailed me and said, "You gave us the blueprint, man." I smiled reading that. Maybe I did. And maybe that's all it takes sometimes. One stubborn farmer. One smart pair of dogs. And one electrified line between what's yours and what people think they can take.